Hello! Today I'm continuing my look at the characters of Final Fantasy VI with a review of the tumultuous brothers of Edgar and Sabin Figaro. Now, to date, I've discussed Final Fantasy VI a couple of times on the channel, and most recently looked at the prominent characters of Terra and Locke, and in each of these discussions I've touched on the themes of duality in the game, which emerges in numerous ways and through numerous characters, but I think most prominently it's characterised in the respective personas and stories of Edgar and Sabin, and the cause and effect of their character arcs and identities are so closely intertwined it seems relevant to discuss them in the same episode at the same time. So, beginning briefly with narrative context and the chronology of the Final Fantasy VI story, Edgar and Sabin also feel necessary to discuss off the back of Terra and Locke, since they are significant in that they are the next important waypoint of the story following our initial escape from Nash, and between them they are a driving factor of the second key scenario, which is our arrival at Castle Figaro and later Mount Colts. And while the purpose of this venture still hinges around Terra and the attempts to hide her from the Empire, there is a general shift in the storytelling upon meeting Edgar and the subsequent recruitment of Sabin, which focuses as much on the plight of these two brothers as it does on the personal plight of Terra and the broader plight of the returners fleeing from Kefka. Now, kicking off first with Edgar, he's established, not unlike Locke, as a rakish, enthusiastic rogue of sorts, but rather than being a treasure hunter, he believes himself to be a dashing ladies' man, and Square have a habit of introducing this sort of character type for comedic effect every so often, with another standout example being Irvine in Final Fantasy VIII and Zidane from Final Fantasy IX. And the root of the comedy is that more often than not, these sort of wanton romantics get shot down constantly, and they're completely undermined by the women they attempt to sort of court. Additionally, this character type also tends to adopt this persona as a facade for something more deep-seated and some insecurity or past trauma, or simply masking for a more sincere and considered personality beneath. And the latter is certainly true for Edgar, who, as his story unfolds, we learn has to cope with the assassination of his father at the hands of the Empire, and yet still entertain the Empire as allies for the preservation of Figaro. He's also sacrificed his own chance for freedom by rigging a coin toss with his brother Sabin over who would rule Figaro, and he puts himself at a severe personal risk in order to aid the returners and ensure the safety of his people over the course of the game. So while the initial impression of Edgar may be a little bit off-putting, I think these layers do unfold to reveal that he is quite an earnest, decent and patriotic character as time wears on. Turning to Sabin, and this is where we can start identifying the dualities between them. While Edgar is a flirtatious but also quite pragmatic, measured character, who, for example, allies to the Empire on the surface because he sees the futility and the threat to his people if he were to oppose them, Sabin is much more impulsive and impassioned as a character. And for example, when their father dies, he completely loses it and seeks to flee Figaro to escape the grief and the associations with his past. And indeed, throughout the game, he becomes one of the key characters in the ensemble who splinters off from the main group and is often left to their own devices. Firstly, when he gets lost on the Leaf River and partners with Shadow, and later again he splinters off and partners with Cyan. So where Edgar is much more integrated with the returners and a natural pragmatic leader, providing planning and so on, Sabin is comparatively autonomous and isolated in places, capable of operating on his own, and indeed, as the player finds, he is elevated much more as a key playable party member at certain junctures of the story. So we can see the independence versus the engagement of the Fellowship there between the two. Now, beyond the dualities of these two personalities, the pragmatic and the impulsive, I also mentioned in my earliest Final Fantasy VI discussion how Edgar and Sabin elicit different aspects of this uniquely science fantasy world, and I've discussed at length over the years, in fact, the wonderfully unique settings of the Final Fantasy anthology that always, to some degree or another, merge Tolkien-esque high fantasy and this sort of knights, mages, woodland creatures sort of vibe with the high futurism of space operas like Star Wars and the mech genre of anime. And through this aesthetic conflation, we often see certain themes explored, such as the dichotomy between the natural and the spiritual, in threat or competition with the scientific and the technological. And where Final Fantasy VI, in a macro sense, explores this, with the espers being processed into Magitech by the Empire, for example, it is also evident in the juxtaposing qualities of Edgar and Sabin, and where Edgar is a specialist, known as a machinist, who has the unique tools ability, which allows him to wield drills and chainsaws, mechanised items, and he's very much posited in the game as an inventor and a technologically adept sort of technocrat. Sabin, on the other hand, is a pugilist and a martial arts practitioner who has mastered the ancient arts of blitz, for example, which allows him to utilise hand-to-hand combat techniques such as Phantom Rush, Tiger Break, so on. And so I really liked the contrast between these two, and how they are two sides of the same coin genetically, and also in other areas, such as their ability to inject humour into situations. And as I've touched on in the past, I think Sabin is particularly hilarious and amusing as a character, particularly when he teams up with Cyan. But I also like how the two brothers are polarised in these certain key ways too, such as the inclination towards the fellowship versus independence, and their adherence to science and the spiritual and the natural respectively. I also think it was one of the more heartwarming subplots when the Figaro brothers sort of reconciled during the game events, and while a lot of focus is rightly offered to the plight of the returners as a collective battle against Kefka and the Gestahlian Empire, I think the Figaro brothers were a huge contributing factor to what made the story succeed so well, and the various personalities that sort of comprised that key fellowship within the returners. So that about wraps up my brief look at the brothers Figaro. If you got this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on the brothers, and please consider sharing, subscribing, and checking the description below for more episodes and details about how you can support the channel.